Speaking of products, I laughed the other day. I saw a Brad Schoenfield. I think I sent you that post. You guys wrote a paper together, and he wrote "Save Your Money."
Yes, that's
and
right.
it was in relation to amino acids, obviously the building blocks of protein, and whether they have any, I guess, role in building muscle and strength, whether they can, have some utility. And at least, his post suggested that there probably isn't a significant benefit from supplementing with BCAAs.
Yeah. So here's the thing, and this brings up a previous question that you raised about leucine and protein doses. So, like, how much can you maximize the anabolic effect of a meal based on leucine content or protein content? And so, leucine is the anabolic driver as far as the amino acids go. So you have the essential amino acids being the most anabolic set of amino acids. And then of the essential amino acids, you have the branched chain amino acids being the most anabolic driving amino acids. And of those branched chain amino acids, leucine is kind of the kingpin of it all. There was a recent systematic review that looked at the concept of leucine trigger and leucine threshold. So the leucine trigger is sort of this question of, does the speed of saturation, or does the speed of peak leucine levels in the blood, does that influence muscle anabolism? And does the actual peak level of leucine in the blood, does that influence muscle anabolism? And so that's like, is there some sort of kinetic type of trigger there that we need to strive for in order to maximize acute muscle protein synthesis? So that's the leucine trigger idea. The leucine threshold idea is the question of what dose of leucine results in maximal muscle protein synthesis. And so that's a little bit more of a practical question. And it turns out that there's a split set of data between older subjects and younger subjects. So with younger subjects, there is a less consistent relationship between the actual leucine dose and muscle protein synthesis. So it appears that you can, like, protein per se, the dose of protein, regardless of leucine amount, seems to max out muscle protein synthesis in younger adults at a certain dosing threshold, which in the majority of the research, it has been roughly 20 to 25 grams, with the exception of McNaughton and colleagues in 2016, who hit the subjects with a high volume, 20 set resistance training bout and saw that 40 grams of protein outperformed 20 grams of protein for raising muscle protein synthesis. So with the exception really of McNaughton and colleagues there, we've mainly seen 20 to 25 grams of protein max out muscle protein synthesis in young subjects.
Why is that the exception, not the rule, that study?
Because they hit them with 20 sets with a full body training bout, and it's just a lot easier to get subjects to do 8 to 12 sets of 2 exercises, leg extensions and leg presses, versus doing the whole, upper body and lower body and racking up 20 sets. It's just a little bit less feasible.
But is that an argument to say if someone's doing a very high volume training program that they should have more protein?
I'll tell you what, dude, there are so many gray areas in the literature, and there's so many myths based on training protocols that don't necessarily reflect what's going on in the real world. So, for example, the McNaughton study, where it was 20 sets, and they showed a superiority of, and it was like 19% higher muscle protein synthesis with 40 grams of protein post-exercise versus 20 grams. That 20 sets, if you take a look at your own resistance training program and you see, okay, for this day I do 4 different exercises and I do 4 sets each. And you see that, okay, well, you're already much higher in terms of training volume than the typical 8 to 12-ish sets that have been done historically in resistance training research. And sometimes I'll hit 16 sets, but I was looking at the number of sets I did per exercise, or rather per training bout. and it's almost always near 20. It's always in the high teens or low 20s when I count the sets that I do in a resistance training bout. And so I think that when you look at the real world stuff, the idea that that young adults have this muscle protein synthesis limit at 20 to 25 grams of protein, I don't think that applies to people who are doing higher volumes of resistance training.
Right, because most of those studies you're saying are, or that finding is informed by studies that were doing 8 to 12 sets.
Yes.
In a session.
Right, sometimes 16.
Mm-hmm. So it might be that if someone is doing more volume, they're creating more kind of muscular damage and therefore need more protein to recover. Is that the hypothesis there?
There appears to be the creation of a bigger reservoir of receptivity for muscle protein synthesis. And this raises an interesting question with the older adults too, because it appears that they require about double the protein dose that young people do to max out muscle protein synthesis acutely or on a short-term basis. And so we haven't really even explored the possibility of hitting older subjects with high volume resistance training and seeing what the limits of protein dosing might be to max out muscle protein synthesis.
So why is it that older adults, I should say, are less sensitive to amino acids and protein?
Okay, that question has kind of a complicated answer. And let me start off by saying that in the general population, who's mostly sedentary, what you said is true. In populations who are trained and highly trained, resistance trained, father time doesn't seem to have much of an effect on receptivity to protein feeding. So when you look at masters athletes, their response to protein feeding, their anabolic response or muscle protein synthesis response is very similar to younger folks.
So this might just be a case of the way that population is living in the, I guess, sedentary lifestyle. Is that similar to the story with like metabolism? You know, for years you hear this idea is as you get older, your basal metabolic rate slows down dramatically. But I've always wondered, how true that is. Is it that the amount of energy you're expending does go down because your metabolism drops, or is it because people are moving less?
Yeah, that's a great parallel because it really is true. Adults, in order for their resting metabolic rate or their total energy expenditure to go down, they have to be losing lean body mass, and they have to be kind of progressively and insidiously, almost imperceptibly moving less year upon year. And that doesn't necessarily happen with certain training populations, certainly physically active populations. And so with your question about, what happens to muscle as we get older, like what underlies this anabolic resistance in people with advanced age? Well, there's two tracks upon which that happens. There's chronologically related, there's age-related changes, and then there are lifestyle-related changes. And frankly, it's hard to totally separate the two. So the age-related changes really would be a decrease in muscle protein synthesis response that's underlied by changes in endothelial health, endothelial function. And so along with age, the degradation of endothelial health results in a reduced microvascular perfusion of blood. So reduced blood flow, and therefore a reduced insulin sensitivity.
Got you. So less able to get certain nutrients
Yes.
and amino acids to the right location to trigger muscle protein synthesis.
That's right. That's right.
Very
So
broadly speaking.
when the vascular structure, the microstructures, when those start to degrade, then you have a lower delivery of amino acids to the target tissues, in this case, skeletal muscle. And this would lower the muscle protein synthesis response to both protein feeding and or resistance training.
That reminds me of a study, and this is a massive side note, looking at cold water immersion after working out.
Yeah.
And they saw lower muscle protein synthesis. And I think the hypothesis was through a reduction in blood flow to the muscle tissue and nutrient delivery.
That's one of the big parts of what impairs the muscle anabolic response of cold exposure is vasoconstriction. You know, you really want to kind of go for vasodilation in the post-exercise period. And some people would say,
have a beetroot juice.
Yeah, have beetroot juice or wait 6 hours, before you do your cold plunge. Just keep it separated by 6 hours or 8 hours. But then, like I mentioned, a single resistance training bout sensitizes muscle to protein feedings for 24 to 48 hours. There's even one study showing that 72 hours post-exercise, you get increased muscle protein synthesis as a result of a single resistance training bout. And so that's why cold exposure, you know what, man, no matter where you freaking put it, if your main goal in life is to gain muscle as quickly as possible, it's going to be a factor that mitigates it. Now, will it crucially mitigate it? Will it just prevent you from making gains? No, probably not. But we have to acknowledge that it's a mitigating factor.
Right. So for the majority of people listening to this show, we might not need to be that rigid. We want to focus on getting the training stimulus is obviously very important, perhaps most important. And then what we've spoken about so far before getting into the weeds of protein distribution and how close, proximity it is to training, just getting your total protein intake over the day sorted.
Yep. That's right. And the training stimulus, as you mentioned, I hesitate to call it the most important thing. I would concede that it has the largest effect, but a lot of folks in the space, especially if they're very exercise focused and exercise biased, they will give all the accolades to the resistance training stimulus and say, protein has got a small effect, It's really the resistance training thing. But I would contend that, look, get them both right, even if the protein effects are smaller than the resistance training effects. And that's how you reach various goals and reach various positive or favorable clinical outcomes as well.
I can imagine people taking that position because in the context without the resistance training, if you just increase protein, what do you see? What happens to muscle protein synthesis, and do you actually see much development of muscle tissue and strength? Yeah,
it's limited. It is definitely limited, and that's been seen meta-analytically, especially in the older population, and it's been seen across populations too. So you need the exercise stimulus to make things happen in terms of muscle size and strength gains.
Hey friends. The scientific evidence on lifestyle habits that lead to longevity is clear. Now it's time to put this knowledge into action. I'm excited to announce the Living Proof Longevity Challenge, a 12-week program to build evidence-based lifestyle habits to optimize longevity. My team and I have transformed over hundreds of hours of conversations with experts on aging, nutrition, and exercise into a life-changing 12-week program that will challenge you to develop habits that lead to a longer, better life. This is a unique opportunity to gather health data about yourself that has the potential to change your life for the better. You'll start by testing 10 longevity biomarkers that tell the truth about where your longevity stands right now, today. Following that, you'll get a personalized longevity score to guide your 12 weeks of habit building that will boost your score and improve your biomarkers for the better. After the challenge, you'll retest your 10 biomarkers and see the proof of how powerful these science-backed habits really are. Head over to theproof.com/livingproof to download your zero-cost copy of the Living Proof Longevity Challenge today. That's theproof.com/livingproof. living proof. Look forward to joining you on this journey. Just circling back to the branched chain amino acids paper that came out.
Yes.
So,
that's right.
So if your total protein over the day is taken care of, then adding a branched chain amino acid supplement or an isolated leucine is not likely to have much of an effect. But what about in the context of, let's say in the literature, if you look at average protein intakes, there's a bunch of different papers we could point to, but let's say it's around 1.1, maybe 1.2, depending on the population. Could be as low as 0.9 on sort of vegetarian populations. In the context of a diet that's not delivering 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram, would there be any benefit to adding in a kind of some type of amino acid supplement?
Yeah, that is a super interesting question because there's a lot of gray area there. And so what we've seen in the literature is that when young resistance training subjects are consuming a total daily protein intake of 1.6 grams per kilogram, which in imperial terms for for my for fellow Yankees out there.
Well, I forget more than 50% of the listeners on this show are based in the United States. So
okay.
They'll be thankful for that.
0.7 grams per pound, you guys.
and just quickly on that though, I want to get your view on this. You walk into a grocery store in this country, we're in LA, and the front of the bottle usually, if we look at a protein drink, usually has ounces. Right? And you guys measure weight in pounds or ounces. But then when it comes to protein, it's on the label, on the same label that has ounces for the total volume, it has the protein in grams.
Yeah.
I've always found that super confusing.
Yeah. It's a marketing thing, probably. It's a labeling thing. People are trying to get their 20 grams of protein per meal. And so that's kind of blasted out there up front. But yeah, in resistance training populations, if you add branched chain amino acid supplementation and or leucine supplementation on top of 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight total for the day, there's no further increases in muscle size and muscle strength. Now, as you mentioned, in the general population who may be consuming amounts that are a little bit above the RDA, somewhere between 20, in some cases 50% above the RDA, like all the way 0.9 to 1.2-ish, 1.3 in some research publications. But unfortunately, the 1.3 reports relate to ideal body weight, is corrected for ideal body weight. And when you look at actual body weight, it's a little closer to 0.9 to 1.0. But that's a little nitpick. For populations who are consuming that amount of protein, then if you're somehow forced to limit your protein to below what's optimal, then supplementing with branched chain amino acids, or even better, all 9 essential amino acids, would be beneficial for muscle growth and possibly muscle strength as well. But we don't typically see that need in younger adults. So with older adults, that's where we would see the issues with being able to consume enough protein. And in the older adult population, protein intakes are commonly right around the RDA, which is not necessarily a good thing if there's frailty involved. So when you look at the general sedentary population, most of, or a lot of whom are either overweight or they have obesity, then the RDA for protein is fine. However, when you're looking at the elderly population where there's a lot of frailty, there's a lot of underweight, then you start seeing more problems with the RDA. I want to qualify that statement I just made about the general population with overweight and obesity consuming the RDA. Okay, I still would like to see that population, if they don't have these sort of specialized athletic goals, consuming at least 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, because then good stuff starts happening with body composition, with satiety, with training performance and such. And I think that the 1.6 figure is a very safe figure to call optimal for most goals. And there's some stuff on the fringe, hypocaloric conditions, bodybuilding type goals, where we can look at protein that's beyond the norm that's recommended in the literature. This 1.6 seems to be this hard cutoff in the literature, but when you dig deep enough, you see benefits of protein intakes that are beyond 1.6. And some of these studies are observational, some are not. And I think it can be worth talking about.